I am Elizabeth Coots. I am the Family and Consumer Sciences Extension Agent here at the Woodford County Extension Office. We're part of the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service. So like I said, tonight we're going to be talking about jams and jellies, and more than jams and jellies actually. But just to remind you or to let you know that our purpose for presenting not only this program, but this whole series of food preservation classes is to let you know about the research-based methods that are out there that we recommend in order for you to have not only a good tasting product, but a safe canned product that you're going to be satisfied with all the work that goes into it. So to start tonight, I am actually we're going to make a recipe. So I'm going to start that process. And just to let you know too, if you should have gotten an email from me with the Zoom link. In that email from me includes a link to all of our University of Kentucky Extension Service publications on food preservation. And included in that publication series is a publication that I have tonight called Home Canning, Jams, Jellies, and Other Soft Spreads. So everything from my presentation tonight comes from this publication. If you would like a printed copy of all of the food preservation publications, you can come here to the Woodford County Extension Office and pick up copies. If you are outside of the Woodford County area, but still in Kentucky, you can contact your local extension office and they can print these publications for you if you would like that. So in the publication, the recipe that I'm going to make tonight is the very first recipe in the publication. It's on page 4 if you have it, if you would like to look at it. It is strawberry jam. Now, I'm going to kind of do things a little backwards maybe tonight because I'm going to get the recipe started and I'm going to be making the recipe and talking at the same time. So I might not necessarily talk about something as I'm doing it, but I will talk about it later. So just like I said, for purposes of time in this webinar. This recipe calls for liquid pectin. So I have that. It comes in a box like this, and it comes in a little pouch like this. I have mine ready here. I've already cut it, and I just have it sitting down in here ready to use. So the recipe calls for 4 cups of crushed strawberries, which it says it's about 2 quarts of strawberries, 7 cups of sugar, and 1 pouch of the liquid pectin. So just three simple ingredients. The directions are to wash your strawberries, pick off the blossom end, and make sure that if there's any bruises or blemishes, to remove those at that time as well. And then you're going to crush your berries. Now, I recommend a potato masher, something like this. This one is a little flatter on the end, so there's a little more surface area and you get a little more mashing with it. You can also use, if your berries are really fresh and in season, which of course we're almost to strawberry season here in Kentucky, not quite. So these berries were a little bit bigger and a little firmer, so it took a little more mashing. It is easier though when you're when you're taking off the end of the strawberry, that you cut the strawberry, maybe in half or quarters or something like that. That makes it a little easier to mash. So you'll crush the berries and then you'll measure. So I have here my crushed berries and I have 4 cups of them. We are going to put those in a saucepan, or excuse me, a stock pot, which I have here. And already in this stock pot, and of course this isn't on the stove yet, but I went ahead and poured the sugar in here. So 7 cups of just regular white sugar. And I'm going to pour my berries in here. And as you can imagine, it already smells good. Smells nice and fresh. Set this to the side. And I'm going to stir this. I'm actually going to move this over here and move my camera angle so that you can better see. I'm not doing too much over here, but, and I haven't turned the burner on yet, okay, because I'm still stirring. I want to make sure that everything is evenly combined I want to make sure that there's no little clump of sugar on the bottom, because as you probably know, sugar on the bottom of a pot, dry sugar for that matter, can burn and stick, and we do not want that at all. So I'm just going to stir this really thoroughly. I can still feel that there's some sugar down there in the bottom. Okay, get it all mixed up. And again, if you don't stir it up well and there are clumps of sugar, the sugar can kind of harden in a clump like that. So I'm just going to do once more over. Of course, it smells really good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn my heat up. Not all the way high though, a medium high, because I don't want to burn my strawberry and sugar mixture. So I'm just going to cover that and leave it back here on the stove. And I'm going to watch that as we go through some of the presentation. And then we'll kind of bob back and forth, like I said, between doing the recipe and talking. So our next step with the recipe is to bring it up to a boil. And then we're going to boil it, like rapidly boiling, for 1 minute. So we'll get there.
I got a question.
Sure, question.
So is that amount of sugar due to taste or a ratio for preservation / acid effect?
Great question. So the ratio of sugar, which, yeah, if you're like me and you're like, oh my gosh, almost double sugar than the berries, that is basically a scientific ratio for strawberries, for crushed strawberries in this specific recipe. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but with any canning recipe, period, whether it's jams and jellies or green beans or salsa, you want to make sure to not change that recipe, whether that's the ingredients in the recipe or the processing time or even the processing method. That recipe has been tested, and not just the recipe, but the process. So when we think about making strawberry jam, you know, this is the process that has been tested, that has been shown, that is the best. Now, if you are interested in using less sugar, that certainly is an option to find a recipe or use pectin that uses less sugar. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Okay, so let's talk for just a minute about jam or jelly. So you notice the name of this class was Jams and Jellies. The name of the publication says Home Canning Jams, Jellies, and Other Soft Spreads. So what does that include? So just to let you know, because a lot of people use jam and jelly interchangeable, not that it's a big deal, but just so that you're aware that there is a difference. So jam is made by cooking crushed or chopped fruit pieces with sugar until the mixture will round on a spoon. So jam is spreadable. It holds its shape kind of, but it's still very smooth. So of course, that's what we're making tonight. We have our crushed fruit that we're adding sugar to. And then jelly is made from juice. When it is jelly, it is clear. It doesn't have any pieces in it, and it holds its shape, almost like if you can think of gelatin. It holds its shape on a spoon, but it should still be spreadable on your toast or your biscuit or whatever. And then butters are made by cooking the fruit pulp with sugar, and you cook it down to a thick consistency, but it spreads very easily, kind of the consistency of applesauce, but a little thicker. And spices are usually added to butters. Of course, we think usually of pumpkin butter and apple butter are the most common. And then a marmalade is a soft fruit jelly that has little pieces of fruit and usually peel throughout the jelly. We, of course, think of orange marmalade with that one that has the pieces of orange rind in it. And then a conserve is kind of like a jam, like that same consistency, but it's made by cooking 2 different fruits with sugar, of course, until it's thick. And a true conserve actually has nuts and raisins included. And then a preserve, the last one, is when you have whole pieces of fruit or bigger pieces of fruit that are basically just kind of hanging out in a thick, clear, sugary syrup. I'm going to reach over here and stir this just a minute, make sure it's Make sure it's not getting too hot too quick on me. Okay, so you maybe didn't realize that there was a difference between all of those fruit spreads. So when we think about canning, in order to ensure that your finished product is going to be safe, like I said earlier, it is very important to not change or modify the recipe, the processing method, or the time. And that does include not changing the amount of sugar too. I will say that there are lots and lots of recipes out there that you can search to find that are safe for canning. That being said, though, there are lots and lots of recipes out there, as you can imagine, that are not safe for canning. So, and we're going to talk a little bit about some resources to find good, safe recipes. And if you're ever looking for a recipe, you know, if you're looking for a plum jam recipe that has less sugar and you can't find one, you are always welcome to call me or contact your local extension office, and we'd be glad to try to help you find a recipe that you're looking for. So currently there are only 2 research-based methods for home canning. We have the boiling water canning method, which we're talking about tonight with jams and jellies, and the pressure canning method. And the method you use depends on what you're canning, as well as if the recipe has an addition of an acid and just the overall quality of canning that product. So as you see on this list here, jams, jellies, and other soft spreads can be safely canned in a boiling water canner, along with everything else that is listed there. So I know I talk a lot about don't change the recipe, you know, use research-based methods, but really safety is the bottom line. Properly canned foods, you know, can be safe, nutritious, and delicious, and we know that foodborne illness from improperly canned foods can happen, and it can potentially be deadly or make you very ill. So that's just, you know, why we recommend using current tested canning procedures and recipes. It's too risky to count on an old family recipe to be safe if you're not sure where that recipe came from. You know, if it just came down the line from your family, you might not know if it's safe or not. That being said, you can always reach out to me and we can check the recipe to see if it is safe or if something needs to be edited. So again, when we think about, you know, bacteria and being on our fresh produce that we're canning, when we think about in canning properly, what we are wanting to prevent is any type of bacteria growing in our jar. Okay, I'm gonna reach over here and stir again, just to make sure. I don't want to get it too hot because I don't want to get it too hot too fast to where it could quickly burn. So back to the bacteria. So this is what we want to prevent. This little bacteria called Clostridium botulinum, and that word might sound familiar, and it's because this is the bacteria that causes botulism, the illness that a lot of people think of with canning. So it's our goal, basically, all these methods and recipes and, you know, the way that it is researched, that's like, if you can think of the worst bacteria. So our goal is to prevent Clostridium botulinum from growing. And if that's our goal, then we are going to have the best quality. And we're also going to prevent any other little nuance bacteria from growing in our canned food. So let's talk a little bit about ingredients. I have my canner of water here going. I'm just going to turn it down a little bit because I don't want it to be boiling. I want it to just be hot. And we'll talk about that. So ingredients in soft spreads that we're talking about. So there's 4: fruit, sugar, acid, and pectin. And it may or may not be, you know, the actual, like, for example, acid. We're not adding an acid tonight, but fruit is naturally high in acid. So the acid is occurring naturally. And of course, there is some sugar and pectin also occurring naturally in the fruit that we're using. So the fruit obviously is the bulk, the main ingredient of our soft spread. And like I said, it does furnish some of the pectin that we need. You want to make sure that whatever fruit you're using, that it is of good quality, because whatever you can, whatever quality that fruit is, that's the quality you're going to get out. So if you have, blueberries that are, they're getting kind of soft and they're about to go bad, and you decide to make some blueberry jelly, you might not have a great product on the end. It may not set up because the fruit is overripe, or it's starting to go mushy. It's just not going to be the best quality. So sugar is the preservative that will help to prevent microorganisms from growing in our jam or jelly. And sugar is something that does have to be present. And we'll talk a little bit about pectin, but there are some other options for low sugar soft spreads. But again, don't change the amount in the recipe. Find a recipe that has less sugar if that's what you're interested in. And also, in a recipe, if it calls for sugar, you can't interchange that with honey or corn syrup or something like that, unless the recipe calls for it, which most of the time it probably won't. And then acid. So the acid is needed to help gel the soft spread. It's very, very much science if you think about all this. So acid is necessary. And of course, the acid amount is different in different fruits. So some recipes you'll see, it does call for lemon juice or maybe orange juice or something like that. But it also contributes to the flavor and the tartness of the soft spread as well. Okay, so it's starting to bubble and boil a little bit, but it's not quite to a rolling boil. And I'll turn the camera back over here. Actually, I guess I could. Oh, our lights are on a timer in here, or not a timer, they are motion activated. We obviously weren't moving enough and they turned off on us. Let's see here. I'm going to switch my view here. Okay, so you can see we're kind of starting to get some bubbles. I might turn it up just a little more. Let that keep going. Okay, so I'm going to talk as I'm stirring. So let's talk a little bit about pectin. So this is the product that makes the soft spread gel. Some fruits contain enough pectin that you don't need to add it. So today, like I said, this recipe, it has added pectin. So we are adding the liquid, and it's not interchangeable, liquid and dry pectin. We'll talk a little bit about that too. But your jams and jellies always need pectin. Okay, so if you can see here now, this boil, it is rolling boiling. So Ruby is going to set a timer for 1 minute. Yeah, okay. And we're going to let this really boil. I might even turn it down just a little bit because it's almost too much of a boil. But I don't want it to stop boiling. There's a sweet spot there. I don't want it to splash out on me either. Ooh, it smells good. I wish you could smell it. So some recipes call for the addition of pectin. Some recipes don't. For example, if you look in your publication of recipes, the first few recipes, they're kind of divided by easy, intermediate, and advanced. So the first few recipes actually, they call for an addition of pectin. The last recipes in the publication, though, do not have pectin included. And that is because you're using the natural pectin in the fruit that you're using, whether it's apples or oranges, in I think a couple of those recipes. All right, stop. Okay, we're going to turn this off. I'm going to remove it from the heat. And our next step is to stir in the liquid pectin. So I'm going to just squeeze this pouch in here. Let's see, you all can't see that, can you? I'm going to just put it. Is that too hot? No, that's not. I'll put it back here so you all can see it. Okay, squeeze the pouch in there. And then I'm going to stir this. And you see in the recipe that, or in the, I'm going to go ahead and move this over here. I know you probably can't see all of it, but that's okay. You see that there is some foam on top. And that's the next step in the recipe, actually, is to skim off the foam. So I'm going to first get a rag to get my fingers unsticky. And I'm just going to use my ladle here. Let's see. Let me scoot it this way, don't I? And I'm just going to kind of pull it back like this, kind of collect the foam. And I can tell that it is already kind of getting thick. That pectin is already working that we put in. I'm just going to clear off the foam. Now, the foam that I am skimming off here is not necessarily a food safety issue. If you have a lot of foam after you can your jam or jelly, it can actually cause your headspace to go down, which isn't ideal. So you do want to scrape off as much of the foam as you can, as you want. I'm not too picky, so I don't mind, leaving a little bit on there. Set this over here to the side, and then later tonight, I'm going to pour that over some vanilla ice cream and have myself a snack. Okay, so our next step then is to go ahead and fill our jars. So I have my jars here. I'll bring them over. And let's see. Yeah, I'm going to switch angles here. Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and fill the jars. So what I like to do, I have my pot here. I'm going to bring my jar over to my jelly here. And yes, I can definitely feel that it's thickening up. I have my canning funnel. Okay, I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to go ahead and fill my jars. What I like to do is go ahead and fill the jars about halfway up the bottom of the canning funnel. And to try not to make a sticky mess, I'm going to move the canning funnel right over to the next jar. And I'm going to go ahead and fill this one up. I like to fill the jars. Ooh, that one was a little too much. Almost to the top. I know my headspace is going to be 1/4 of an inch for jams, jellies, marmalades, any soft spread. It's going to be 1/4 of an inch. So what I'll do is go back and adjust the headspace to make sure that it is correct. So what I'm doing right now is just getting it close. I'm just guesstimating and getting the jam in the jar, and I'll come back and make it a little more accurate. Well, a lot more accurate, because I'm going to make sure that it is exactly the correct headspace. And like I said, it is 1/4 of an inch headspace that I'm going to use. Now this canning funnel that I'm using, this actually, it not only helps you to get the product in the jar, but it has another feature that I like, is to keep the rim of your jar clean. And you'll see that our next step in the canning process is to wipe the jar rim. And as you can imagine with jams and jellies, it's sticky. So wiping the jar rim can be kind of hard, like that one that I accidentally overfilled a little bit and had to pour it out. That one's probably going to be sticky. So if you use your canning funnel and you protect the rim of the jar, it makes your life a lot easier when you have to go back through and wipe the rim of the jars. Now, I think what is going to happen here, and I'm going to lift up my pot here and pour, because there's just a little bit left in here. Yep, this is what this happens a lot. Okay, so I have just a little bit left in there. So when I pour it in my last jar here, let's see how much it is. It is about, scrape out all the stuff, get it in there. It is about 1/2 of a jar. So it doesn't fill it up all the way. Now, I want to quiz you with this jar that is halfway. What should I do with that jar? and I'm going to let you type in the chat, what should I do with this jar that is half full while I go through, and if you're not sure, that's okay. I'm going to tell you. I'm going to go through and check the headspace. So this tool that I'm using is a headspace tool / bubble remover. And on one end, it's like a plastic knife. You can stir your product if you have pieces, so like salsas and green beans, those kind of things. You want to stir because if there's any air trapped in the bottom, that's going to affect your headspace. So I'm now going to take my little headspace tool and I'm going to go around and see what I need to adjust. So this one is right at 1/4 of an inch and this one needs a little more. So I'm actually going to take this jar that only had 1/2 in it and pour so that my headspace can be exact. So I'm just going to go around and make these exact. And actually, you know what? What are some of the things people put in the chat to do with that extra jar?
So use it to adjust the headspace.
Yay! Like you read my mind.
Or eat it over ice cream.
Yes.
In the refrigerator and eat.
Yes, very good. Now, so what is happening now as I go back and adjust my headspace? I have had to use another jar because I needed a lot more than I thought. So now I used that 1/2 and now I have another 1/2. So I will set that aside and eat, maybe add that to my ice cream tonight. So the next step is to wipe the jar rims. I'm going to turn that down because I don't want that to boil again. Okay, so I'm going to start with the ones that look pretty clean so I don't dirty up my rag too much. So I'm just going to wipe the rim, just the top of the jar, just the flat part there. And of course, if it's slopped over the side, like that one that I spilled out of, you might want to wipe the sides of that. But the most important part is the top rim of the jar, because when we put our flat lid on, we want to make sure it seals. That is, this is the one I messed up a little bit, spilled a little bit, but hey, that's okay. I always say, if you're not messy when you're canning, especially when you're canning jams and jellies or pickles, are you really canning? You've got to get sticky. That's just part of it. You know what? I'm going to look at this headspace again here. I see that is just a little too much. So I'm going to have to wipe the rim again. And I'm just going to take a little out of there, just like that. So I'm going to wipe this one again. Make sure it's completely clean all the way around all of them. So let's see, this is making 2, 4, 6, 8 jars, 8 1/2 pints, and the recipe does say 8 or 9 1/2 pints, so that's pretty accurate. So now I'm going to take my flat lid and just lay it on the jar here. We'll talk a little bit about lids in a minute. And then I'm going to take the rings and I'm going to put these on. And I am not going to tighten this down as hard as I can. I'm just going to do fingertip tight, okay? I'm just tightening it to where I meet resistance so that it is nice and tight on that jar lid. The only purpose of the rings is to hold the lid on while you're canning. So, and we'll talk at the end, but after your jar has cooled and you're ready to store it, you do not need to leave the ring on. Okay, so I'm going to set the lid over here. And I'm going to turn my camera so that you can see what I'm doing here. So I'm going to take my jars and just set it down in this water. Now there's some bubbles coming up, if you can see that as I put them in, and that is just the air bubbles that are around the lid. So those air bubbles are just coming up out of there. So I'm going to space these around so that there's space in between them. I don't want them to be touching in the canner. And it's a little bit of a puzzle usually. Let's see, I have 2 more jars. I think I'm going to scoot that one over a little, get room in here for 2 more jars. And And the last one will fit right down in there. That might be a little close. I'm going to just scooch these over. And of course, when you're boiling water canning, they do wiggle around a little bit. It gets going pretty good in there. So now we're going to put the lid on. I'm going to turn this up to high, and we want the water in our canner now to get to a rapid rolling boil, like really boiling, like to the point where you think, oh my goodness, it's boiling too much. That is exactly how you want it to be, is a rolling video. Oops, sorry about that. So we'll wait on that. Once it does start boiling, we're going to time it for 10 minutes. So it's important to remember that with boiling water canning, you start your time when the water's boiling. And again, your recipe will tell you that time. Okay, so let's go back to pectin. So if you are using full sugar, you want to make sure to use regular pectin. And so it comes powdered, like in a little box like this, and in a pouch, looks like this. It's just powder. Oh, and this has a hole in it. And probably more liquid. There are recipes. So if you're not sure, or if you just want to experiment with it, you can use the recipes that are in the box of pectin. Okay, so we are now at a rolling boil. And I'm going to switch the view back again, just so that you can see. I'm not sure how clear. Yeah, I think you can see pretty well that it is rocking and rolling, as I like to say. So we're going to set a timer for 10 minutes, and just let that boil. We're not going to turn it down. If it seems like it's boiling too much, that's good. It needs to boil vigorously for 10 minutes. So pectin also comes in liquid form, which of course is what we're using today. It comes in a box like this. It also has recipes included. So just make sure that you're using regular pectin with full sugar, or the reduced sugar pectin with less sugar. And if you're going to make freezer jam, you would use instant pectin. So lots of different kinds of pectin out there. So I mentioned a little bit about this earlier, that some recipes call for added pectin and some recipes don't. There's benefits, there's pros and cons to either way. So if your recipe, like ours today, calls for added pectin, typically you have a shorter cooking time and you have a greater yield. So if you were going to make strawberry jam without added pectin, you probably wouldn't get 9 jars or 8 jars like we did today. You're also going to have a better color. You can use fully ripe fruit, and you have less chance of failure for the jam or jelly to gel, to set up. It's kind of pectin, commercial pectin is kind of like an added pectin, a safeguard that you have. So if you have a recipe that doesn't have added pectin, typically you have a longer boiling time, you have less added sugar, and you may or may not have a loss of flavor. Maybe, not necessarily, but those are just some considerations to think of. We are really rocking and rolling over here. I can hear it. And you can probably, you see the steam that's coming out, and there's just a little bit of moisture that's dripping off the lid, so that's okay. That's exactly what we need. So if you're wondering if a fruit has enough pectin, you can do a test. There's 2 tests that you can do, a cook test and an alcohol test. The cook test, you would take 1/3 cup of whatever juice you're wanting to use. So if you're wanting to make blueberry jelly, you would take 1/3 cup of blueberry juice. And 1/4 cup of sugar, you would heat that over the stove until it's completely dissolved. You want it to boil rapidly until it sheets from a spoon. So that's essentially, and I think I have the next, oh, I did. Okay, thought I had a picture. But it's basically where the jam or jelly is really thick on the spoon and it slowly drips off. So it takes a little while to cook that until it's thick like that. You will then pour it into a bowl to cool. So just, out of the pot and into a bowl and let it cool down. And when it's cool, it's jelly-like, then you know that there's enough pectin in that fruit that you don't need to add added pectin. And then the other option is the alcohol test. So you can take a teaspoon of your juice, so if you were doing the blueberry juice, a tablespoon of rubbing alcohol, and mix that together in a closed container, kind of shake it a little bit. You want to make sure that it's completely mixed together. And if it forms kind of a solid jelly-like mass, then there's enough pectin in that fruit. You should be able to pick it up with a fork, and you know that there's enough pectin in there. So that's a pretty cool little science project that you maybe do just for fun. So with the process, we talked a little bit about this, about filling jars and the funnel and the headspace. But again, this part is important in any recipe because that is part of the science. That's part of what has been researched and shown that this is how much headspace jam and jelly needs based on what is in the jar. And just a reminder that, I talked about the headspace bubble remover tool, and it's plastic, and it's recommended to use plastic instead of metal, especially inside the jar. Even if you're scooping out, to adjust the headspace in your jars, it's recommended to use plastic, especially if you are having to remove bubbles. So if you typically don't need to do that in jams and jellies and soft spreads, but if you had salsa or something like that, you use the other end. But you want to make sure also not to have metal in the jar. It could cause a reaction with whatever the food product that you're canning, and it could also chip the jar. So recommended to just use plastic. And again, the headspace, which is that air in between the level of the liquid or the product in the jar and the bottom of the flat lid that's on your jar. And this is also important because it helps to create that vacuum seal. That noise, if you've ever canned before and you bring your jars out and you hear that pop, the music to a canner's ear, I like to say, the headspace helps to create that vacuum seal, a true vacuum seal. And not just a seal that's not a vacuum. Because a jar can seal without a vacuum. I have had brand new jars in my car coming, from the store, and it's been a hot day, and I've heard them pop in the back. Well, it's not a vacuum seal. It may have popped down just because of the air temperature, but it's not a proper vacuum seal. So don't be canning in your car. Okay, so we've kind of gone through this process, but some things that I did before we came on. So my canner, I filled it about 2/3 of the way with hot water, so just hot water from the tap, and I have a canning rack in the bottom. Now this canner, and most boiling water canners, come with a rack that looks something similar to this. I tend personally to not like these racks. This is the rack that came with this canner. It's very nice and all, especially if you're canning with quarts, something big, it's fine. But for little jelly jars like we're using today, I like to use a rack like this that typically is used in a pressure canner. It's flat. It still has holes in it. Okay, it's still a rack. It has 5 little feet around it. But it's flatter, and I can better adjust my jars. Because in this rack, it's hard to see, but it can be difficult to balance your jar right on the metal rings. If it gets off, it's tilted just a little bit, and it's just, I don't know, it's kind of like a little puzzle. It's certainly okay to use, but you can use the rack that's out of your pressure can too. So that's what we're using today. So you'll go ahead, like I did earlier, keep the water warm, very warm, but not boiling it. And then at that time, you'll prepare your recipe like we did. We had it all ready over there. So once you've prepared your recipe and you're ready to put your jars in your canner, and of course we've done this process, but when you're lifting your jars into the canner, you want to make sure to keep them level. Okay, you don't want to tilt them to push other jars around and get them in there. Keep them level, and that's just to help to prevent any food product getting on the bottom of the lid and potentially getting around that seal. Because again, like when we were wiping off the rims, we want to make sure that connection between the top of the jar and the bottom of our lid is free of any particle so that it can form a proper seal and create that vacuum seal. So at that time, sorry. Okay, there we go. And make sure to check your recipe so that you know what the processing time. So jars, just talk a little bit about jars briefly. You want to make sure that you're using a mason type jar that has been designed for canning. Of course, they can be used over and over and over again. They're designed to be through the heating process multiple times. So inspect your jars every year just to make sure there's no nicks or cracks. And then of course the flat lid, which every time you can, you have to have a new lid. Okay, these cannot be reused. So after you use it, toss it. The ring again can be used over and over and over as long as it's not bent or nicked or rusty. That's very common. And I have one here that's an old rusty ring that I use it for demonstration purposes because it is too rusty. So I'm not going to use it. We always going to stand back and remove the lid. This cool down just a little bit. Now, when I say cool down, will you set a timer for 5 minutes, Ruby? Because we just want the water to stop boiling and just kind of chill out for a minute. It is going to cool down, though, from boiling. Okay, so we're going to continue with that slow process of cooling. Okay, so that's with the jars. With jams and jellies, you see, so today we're using, let me just hold this up, the half-pint jars. And there are also the little jam and jelly jars. If you want to use the little jam and jelly jars, you certainly can, but you don't change the processing time in your recipe. So if I was using the smaller jam and jelly jars, I would still process it for 10 minutes. So that is an option as well. Let me go back there. One of the tools that I used, but I didn't talk about, is the jar lifter. So this is for, as you can imagine, lifting jars, not only into the water, but out of the water. It's a very handy tool. And if you're going to be doing any canning at all, these tools, this set of tools, is going to be worth it for sure. It will be definitely worth the little bit of money invested in it. Now, you see one tool on the screen that is no longer needed. It is a long wand there, that dark green stick in the middle there. It has a magnet on the left end. So it used to be recommended that you put the flat lids in hot water before you put it on your jar. And the reason for that was to soften the plastisol that is around the lid. But because this is a new compound around here, that step is no longer needed. So that little magnetic wand or lid lifter is not needed anymore. A lot of times you can buy these 4 items together in a kit, and that lid wand is still included. You can, I know there's some people that they still feel like they want to put those lids in warm water, and you certainly can. You know, it's just an extra step. Make sure they're clean. You can certainly do that, but it's not necessary anymore. So with a boiling water canner, what you see on the screen is typical, I think, what a lot of people think of as a boiling water canner, but you don't have to have something that looks like that. You don't really even have to have something that looks like this. You just have to have a pot that is big enough to cover. So when you put water in your canner, that you can cover your jars with water about 1.5 to 2 inches. So I could easily can jam and jelly in these little jars in just a stock pot. As long as it's tall enough that you can, fit the water over it, and as long as you have a rack in the bottom, because you don't want your jars sitting directly on the bottom of the canner, because that can be too intense of a heat, too close. The other thing that you don't really have to have, but it certainly helps, is a lid. And that, of course, when we're boiling like that, a lot of water is going to be evaporating. So having a lid just secures the heat in there, and you don't have to add water. Which, speaking of, if at any point during the processing time your water drops below 1 to 2 inches, then you'll need to add water. And I didn't talk about measuring the water in the beginning because I can clearly see that there is a lot of water above these jars. If you're not sure, a tool that you can use is your headspace tool. You can just dip that down in the water and touch just the edge of one of your jars, and you know that this is 1 inch. So you can, kind of take a guide to see if this is about 2 inches and, where is 1.5 inches in there. So that's a good way to know for sure that you have enough water. If you see that your water has evaporated, like maybe you don't have a lid for the pot that you're using, and you see your water has evaporated and the level has lowered a little bit, you can add water. You want to make sure, though, that you add boiling water so that your water doesn't stop boiling. So I had over here an electric tea kettle right here, full of boiling water, ready for me to grab if I needed it. I didn't need it, though, because like I said, there's plenty of water over these jars. If at any time during your processing time, your water stops boiling, if you look in there and it, it's not rolling, then you need to turn your heat up or figure out what happened, why it stopped boiling. Did you, blow a breaker or something? You accidentally hit the knob. So if it stops boiling during the processing time, you want to turn it up, get it boiling again, and you need to start your processing time over. So you will start, back at 10 minutes or however much it is. Okay, let me switch back over here. And we will remove our jars. Yay! So I'm going to set them, let's see here. Set them right here on this. My jar lifter. And see, I was talking about how the jars will kind of move around. See, now they're all touching. They're all together. They all huddled together, and that happens. Now, when you take the jars out, just like when you put them in, we're going to keep them completely upright. We don't want to tilt them. And you may be tempted to tilt them, like I am tempted to tilt them, because there is water on the very top of that jar because it's been submerged in water. So of course there's a little bit of water on top. So resist the urge, if you're like me, resist the urge to tilt that jar to remove the water and just keep your jars upright. You don't want to cause any jars to potentially not seal. I don't know if you all heard that, but I heard one pop. And I like to hear that. Okay. So I'm going to leave that right there and switch. And we're going to talk about, we're not finished talking about what we do next, but I'm going to get back to the presentation here. Okay, so that is the canner. Any pot that you have that's tall enough, that has a rack, and hopefully a lid, you can use as a boiling water canner. So you don't have to go out and buy any fancy equipment. Okay, so you see down, in this step, so we, oh, did you hear that? Another one popped. So at this point, what we're going to do, we are going to let these jars sit for 12 to 24 hours. Another one. I'm going to start counting. And I don't know if you noticed that I purposefully sat these jars down strategically. I spaced them out, and that's very important. You want to make sure that there is enough space around the jars for airflow, because at this time, we are wanting our jars to cool down. But we want to cool them down slowly. We don't want to cool them down rapidly. So again, that's part of the process, that we heat it up very slowly and keep it steady at that hot temperature for a certain amount of time. And then we're going to cool it down again very slowly. So the waiting 12 to 24 hours is just part of that process. So, with this process, you see also that I have a towel down. I hope you can hear all the popping in the background. I don't know if that's coming through the camera or not, but they're definitely popping. So having the towel down just helps, partly to prevent any coolness of like a countertop, especially if you have a natural granite, or like we have a metal countertop over here in our commercial kitchen. I would not set jars on this metal countertop to cool, because it would be too cold, and that could cause the jars to break. You also want to make sure that there's no fan or air blowing on the jars. And you also don't want to lay a towel on top of the jars. That's something, I think a lot of people, feel like, oh, put my towel on there to protect them. But when you put your towel on there, what you're doing essentially is insulating the jars. So you're trapping some of that warmth in, and it's going to take a lot longer for those jars to cool down, which could potentially be unsafe. So keep the towel off and let them just naturally cool off. And again, that 5 minutes of waiting for the water to cool down after boiling is just part of that process. We let it cool down a little bit for 5 minutes. We take it out here, space them out, and let them naturally cool down. To the end of the PowerPoint anyway. So I'll just look at my screen and continue to talk about the rest of it, because there's not too much more to see on the screen. So again, at that time, after the 12 to 24 hour mark, as long as your jars have sealed, that's when you will label it, and you will be so proud of yourself. So label it with what it is, and then also the date, because you might think you remember, but you probably won't. So make sure to put that right on the lid, and that's actually a really good place to write what it is and the date, so that you know if you're gonna, save your lid to use a craft project, or like I like to save my lids to put on the jars that have my dehydrated food in it. So I know that lid has been used for canning, and I'm not going to use it for canning again. At that time also, you can remove the ring, wipe the jar rim, around if it's needed. Sometimes a little bit of moisture builds up under there. And of course, moisture and metal creates rust, which we don't want. So you can store your jars just like this. And actually, we recommend to store them just like this. There's no need to have that lid on there, because if you have processed it correctly, the lid is sealed. That lid's not coming off until you go to pry it off. So like I said, the ring just helps to keep that lid on during the whole processing and cooling time. So at that time, you can store your jam or jelly in a dark, cool place for about 2 years is what we recommend. If you have gone through the procedures and use a research-based recipe, it'll keep for longer than that. But after that, the quality of the product will start to decrease. And of course, after you open your jar, when we talk about spoilage, you would typically with jams and jellies, you would see it, you would smell it, and you would know, of course, not to eat that product. But jams and jellies are relatively easy, and especially if you're new to canning, it might be something that you decide to start doing first. Maybe this is the first thing that you start doing. I want to talk a little bit about some resources. So we talked earlier about, I've talked all night about use research-based recipes and methods. And through the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service, all of our publications or the information and the research that our publications are derived from come from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And the National Center for Home Food Preservation is housed at the University of Georgia. And they have some great resources. Their website, they have lots, not only recipes, but just tips and tricks and best practices of canning. Because yeah, well, you know, like tonight we covered the bases of jams and jellies and canning. There are other tips and tricks out there that you can use and gain from other people that you can use in your home. So with recipes and methods, there is a book called So Easy to Preserve that is available, that is kind of like our canning go-to, or not just canning, but food preservation go-to resource here. And you're also probably familiar with the Ball and Kerr brand. Not that I am endorsing them, but Ball and Kerr, which is owned by the same company, they have their own testing center. So they are creating their own research and their own research-based recipes and methods. So the Extension Service and the National Center have basically said they know what they're doing. They are doing it right, and we trust their recipes and methods. So that's another resource. They have a great website. There's books. I mean, this is, you know, a book that's out there that has lots of information. Right on the front of this, they have some kind of what looks like a jam on the front here. So there are lots of resources out there. And like I said earlier, if you're looking for a resource, if you're looking for a specific recipe, you can always contact me here at the Woodford County Extension Office. You have my contact information, and you can also reach out if you're outside of Woodford County to your local extension office. That's what we do. That is what we're here for. We're here to help you. So do we have any questions? No questions.
We'll see if any pop up.
All right, very good. One thing that I just realized that I forgot to mention, that's a little tip, especially if you live here in Central Kentucky where we have hard water. And I don't have a jar that has it, but if you can, with the water that we have here in Central Kentucky, you may see a film on the outside of that jar, kind of an opaque looking film. That's caused from the minerals in the water that builds up on that jar. One thing you can do to prevent that is to add just a little bit of white distilled vinegar to the water in your canner. And that will help to neutralize any of those hard water minerals to prevent that buildup on your jar. So I missed that. It looks like there's a question, but I can't see it.
Yeah, it says, assuming brown sugar instead of white sugar is a no-go.
That is a very good assumption, whoever asked that. So, and actually I'll expand on that a little bit, because there are lots of different types of sugar out there. So in your recipe, if it just says sugar, it is just white sugar. And most canning, you know, appropriate research-based canning recipes call for just sugar. But you're right, brown sugar is a no-go. If you are interested in using a different type of sweetener, then this is probably going to be your best bet, is to use the low sugar added pectin. But yeah, that's a great question for sure. And even, you know, honey or corn syrup, you know, you can't exchange any of those for what it calls for in your recipe, unless the recipe calls for that. So don't exchange it. Yeah, but great question about sugar. All right, well, if you have any further questions, you know how to reach me. Have a great night, everybody.